Y'all are great. Man, you sounded good tonight. That's all right. It's good. All right, so let me ask you this question. Do you have in your group, do you have that one student who's, okay, so do you have that student who's always getting lost? All right, so some of you do, like, I don't know, like this is how it usually plays out. You sit down for group time, and somebody's like, where is she? Like, she's always gone. No one knows where she's at, or even worse yet, you get ready to get on the bus, you get ready to get on the van, everyone's loaded in, and you get ready to take off. Maybe you did on the way here, take off. And that student, again, they're just lost, and you're like, where in the world are they? Man, we had that student in my student ministry, it was a number of years ago. This guy, kid you not, it was like Wednesday night. And there's a certain kid on Wednesday night who, he was never where he was supposed to be, and this Wednesday night, we just kind of assumed he was off doing something, and sure enough, he was running away from his friend. And our youth group met at this old, antique house. And so he's running away from his friend, and they were chasing each other through the house. We were all in the living room. We were all meeting, praying, getting ready to close out the evening. I'm like a 23-year-old youth minister, and these two guys are running in the back end of the house. And as he's running away from his friend to get away from him, I kid you not, he goes through this doorway, and he goes to pull this door shut. And just as he pulls this antique wooden door shut, his friend runs up behind him and pushes on the door. And as he pushes on the door, his hand is still in this door as he's pulling it shut. All we heard was a door slam. And he comes back into the room. I remember this so clearly. His hand is up. His ring finger is out. But it's like Frodo in Lord of the Rings when his finger's cut off. It's flat and jagged and red. And there is blood pouring down his elbow and dripping a line of blood onto the wooden antique floor as he goes into the middle, not the side, but the middle of the youth group and says, "I'm gonna die!" Now, there were also some compassionate students in the room who said, "He's gonna die!" And then I kid you not, there's probably these students in the room too. Maybe some sponsors in the room, arms crossed. They're like, he deserves to die, right? And then there's me. I'm the student minister, fairly new. I just kind of gone through college, and I'm kind of learning the ropes. And I'm like, they never trained me for that. All right, lost fingers, okay. But I'm thinking inside, I'm gonna die, right? I mean, I don't know. I didn't have a high voice like that when I was 20. But at the same time, this moment happened, and it was crazy, this chaotic moment. So this is probably not what we should have done. We called 911. I don't know, right? No one trained me for this. So this kid is student is ushered outside into the parking lot. His fingers cut off. The students are all dismissed. They're huddled together with their parents, some of them crying, compassionate people. Others are shaking their head. And then I have the job of going into the kitchen. And my job is to find this lost finger. I've never had to look for a fingernail on a finger before, not attached to a body. And so I found it. It took me a bit. And then I was like, what do you do with it once you find it? There it is. So I grab a piece of paper. It's probably, I don't know, some random piece of trash on the counter from youth group, because youth buildings are all clean, you know. Grab that, kind of shuffle it on with another piece of paper, and I picture it this way. I don't remember this part of the story. Everything was so traumatic up until then, everything else is blocked out. But can you picture this? I picture it like the end of Top Gun. You may not know, but I'm that old. So I come out and I picture the fire trucks are there, the parents are there, the mom of this kid is there. And I come out and I say, I found it! And everyone cheers, right? And everyone cheers. And I put on my aviator glasses, and I'm the hero of the story at that particular point. I have no idea how that actually played out. But here's what I do know. Like, it really mattered to that kid that what was lost was found. Now, I don't know. You're like, that's a weird transition to the story today. And it is. I don't know if you've ever lost something of value to you. I mean, I've lost things like my car keys, my iPhone. I've lost things like, I don't know, a kid. Don't tell my wife. No, she was there. We were at Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri. We call it Redneck Disney. And at Silver Dollar City, if you've ever been to an amusement park, you kind of know how this goes, even if you've not been there. At the exit, end of the day, everyone kind of in masses exiting the park, and they want to funnel everyone through the bookstore, the gift shop, to make sure that, kids can beg their parents, and their parents are tired, and they're like at the end of the day, so they're going to buy stuff just to keep their kid quiet. Not me, by the way. And so, like, we're all funneling through the gift store, and we're all in this crowd, and my son, he's probably 6 or so at the time, and somewhere in that chaos, my son, who's a middle child, sorry middle children, you always get lost. I have some of you right now. Somewhere in the shuffle, Sawyer got lost. And we didn't notice it for maybe 25 yards or so. And then all of a sudden, because everyone forgets middle children, we kind of did a kid check. We had the baby, we had the oldest child who was faithfully following behind. And Sawyer was gone. I love my boy. I love my girls. But all of us in that moment panicked. As we turned around, all we saw was a sea of faces, anonymous faces. Faces that kind of looked at us awkward, like, why are you turning around now? Do you know we're all trying to get out of this hot, humid place and get to our car? Why are you looking backward? And then we had to make that awkward move back through the crowd. I think at some point people saw the panic on our faces as we cried out a name that they didn't know, but a name that I'm sure they were able to connect the dots and go, that's the name of their child. Sawyer! Where are you, buddy? Sawyer's lost. I mean, sometimes you lose things of great value to you, and sometimes you are that thing which is of great value that is lost. Jesus loves to tell stories. It's one of the things I love about Jesus' teaching. I mean, he loves to tell stories. You've been hearing about these stories all week. This morning, you were introduced to the story of 2 lost things. A lost sheep, which maybe if you're not like a shepherd, you're like, okay, a lost sheep, no big deal. But if you're a shepherd and that's how you make a living, pretty big deal. A lost coin, a lady who loses a coin, she only has so many, so she loses a coin and it's lost, it's gone, so she shuffles around her house, sweeps her house. Maybe you've done this for, lost iPhones, AirPods, keys. And then when she finds it, like the shepherd and like this woman, they both celebrate. Jesus has been telling stories. I love that Jesus loves to tell stories. Because one of the things about a story is when you hear a story, you kind of just automatically, even when I say, there was a certain young boy, you all were crazy when I walked out here. I love the band. And as soon as I start telling a story, y'all do exactly what my kids do when they were little. You go, oh, and you listen in, and then all of a sudden you're leaning in, and then somehow God has created us that somehow you land in the story and you're living in it. I mean, it's part of the reason, when I was a little kid, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out. It's part of the reason why, my brother and I, we became the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was Leonardo, he was Michelangelo. It's part of the reason when I read the story as a little boy, My Side of the Mountain, I wanted to run away from home and live in the woods and have a peregrine falcon, right? It's part of the reason why my daughter sings, my youngest daughter, not my oldest daughter, sings Let It Go. It's why my son in Missouri, and almost all the boys his age, want a Patrick Mahomes haircut. Because when we hear even a story that's a real story, even a sports story, we listen in and then we find ourselves leaning in and then we find ourselves landing in the story. My oldest daughter, she loved a couple years ago those online personality tests that when you get the results, you actually find out which character you are in some of your favorite stories. And she was always amazing character. She's like Hermione. She's these characters that you're yeah, Katniss. And then she's like, Dad, you should take these tests. And I roll my eyes, and I'm like, okay, let's take this test. And I'm always like Lord Voldemort, right? Like Emperor Palpatine. And she's like, that's exactly what I thought you would get. And I'm like, what is that supposed to mean? Right? But why does she love those? Why does she and her friends love those personality tests? Well, number one, they're trying to figure out their identity, but they're also figuring that out by figuring out who they are in a story. It's part of the reason why Jesus loves to tell stories, is because we listen in and then we lean in and then somehow we land in the story. So tonight, we're in Luke 15, and Jesus tells a story. And as we listen into the story of Jesus, here's my guess. You're going to find yourself listening into the story. If you listen in, you're probably going to end up landing in the story. And in this story, there are three characters. In fact, what Jesus says in Luke 15 as he opens up the story is he says, there was a man who had 2 sons. And if I could this evening shine the spotlight on these 3 characters, my question for you, just like that online personality test question, which character are you? I'd like to ask you the question in Jesus' story. So, which one of these characters are you? There was a man, Jesus said, who had 2 sons. And if I were to shine the spotlight on one of them, I would actually come over to the younger son. Are there any youngest siblings in the room, by the way? Here's the deal. I'm the oldest child. Any oldest siblings in the room? Like right away when we start this character, I'm like judging him. I'm like, youngest siblings, that's how they are, right? Like, so Jesus tells this story. He says, there was a younger son. And here's what he said. He said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. Now, I don't know if he said it as smug as that, but Dad, here's what he says. And scholars actually say culturally, this is like the youngest son saying, hey, Dad, will you go ahead and die? Because I'd really like my stuff that I'm going to get when you die, I'd like it now. Now, if he's not saying that, at the very least what he's saying is this. Dad, I actually care more about your stuff than I care about a relationship with you. So can I go ahead and just get the stuff? If I were to put a label on this youngest son and ask you the question, which character are you, in your group time or as you're reflecting back on our time together this evening, I'd want you to remember this son with this label. Not the youngest son, but we're going to call him the runaway son. And in some ways, we're going to see that this youngest son, like the young student in my youth group who had his hand up, bloody, this youngest son, this runaway son is going to find himself wounded. And in some small way, he's going to say, I'm going to die. And maybe that's you. There's another son that we'll come to at the end of our time together tonight. This is the oldest son. In some ways, I don't want to have much in common with this son, but in some ways, I find myself in this story going, that's me sometimes. If I were to put a label on this son, that one would be the runaway son, this one would be the resentful son. And rather than having his hand up, I would actually picture him with his arms crossed. And then in the middle, between these 2 sons, Jesus says, there's this father. And so I'd like to have, as we enter into this story, as we listen in and lean in and land in this story, I'd like to ask you this question. How do you land in this story then? The youngest son says, Father, give me my share of the estate. And I don't know, but I probably read through that rather quickly and don't hear the heart of the father that gets wounded by these words of his son. I have 3 kids. They've had plenty of opportunity to say things at times that hurt me far deeper than they could ever imagine. Now, I've said some of those very same things to my parents. I don't know your last interaction with your parents. And I really don't even know where your parents would land in this story. They might actually be the runaway son or the resentful son. I think as parents sometimes our parents, and I'm called to be, as a parent, a model, a mirror of who this father is in this story. But maybe your last words were pretty toxic. before you got in the van and got on the bus and headed to move? How do you land in this story? But the question that happens, the surprise that happens in this story is that the father does something weird. He actually divides up his property. Like, no questions asked. And the word here for property in the story is actually, we know this word. The word is where we get the word biology. The word is bios. It's the word for life. We can actually say the father divided up his life between his two sons. That makes sense, because you spend your life gaining property. And so if you're going to give away half of your property or a third of your property to the youngest son, the older son gets 2/3, sorry. But if you're going to divide that up, you're actually giving away your life. That's why, by the way, when you give away your money and you're generous, even an offering here, you're actually saying, I'm giving up my life to give to someone else. The father divides up his estate. He gives it. Not long after that, the youngest son, Jesus says, he got together everything he had and he went away. He set off for a faraway country. And then it says he squandered his wealth, which wasn't his in the first place, in wild living. And then after he spent everything, there was a famine. These words are interesting because the word's actually the opposite of saving or being saved. This son actually takes what was the father's life and then he scatters it like seed. And then this wild living word is the opposite of saved. He unsaves it. The things that the father has saved, the son is now squandering away. And boy, sometimes when I stand in this story, I go, God, I can do that. Like some of the things you've given me, God, they're so good. And I can take them and I can just use them in ways that are flippant and are really just selfish and on me, rather than spending them on things that have value to you. And the things that you've given, I can actually unsave and ungive. And then the story says, then this son, after he was living it up, like got to this point in the story where the text says he began to be in need. Wait, I thought he had everything he wanted. I thought he got everything from the father that he could possibly want. Give me my share of the inheritance. I'm going to go live the life that I want. And then Jesus says he was actually like empty. Now, I don't know. It's just a guess. I've spent just the last 24 hours on campus with y'all. But my guess is this: some of you find yourself having squandered some things that God has given you. Maybe live in some ways that you know the Father has not designed you for, called you to. And you get to a spot where you're like, I thought this would meet my needs, but I'm still just empty. And there's this famine, like friends leave you and these things don't please you anymore. And you just find yourself somewhat disillusioned with all of that. And you're looking around and you're like, how am I going to meet my needs? And there's this famine in your life. And you're like, I'm just hungry for something more. He's like, man, I got to meet a need. And so he goes out into a country. And if you're Jewish, he finds a job that would be, we'd consider it like a reputable job. But for them, it was a dirty job. He becomes a pig farmer. And he's looking at the food that the pigs are eating, and these pods that are growing there, they're kind of like if like a rotten banana were to have a baby with a snap pea. That's like what these pods are. And so he's like, man, like if I could just have those, maybe those would meet my needs right now. Notice how like low he's gotten. Like trying to find something, anything to meet his need. And then if it couldn't get any worse, Jesus says in the story, but no one gave him anything. No one's there for him, and he has nothing left. So he comes to his senses, Jesus says. And he says this, how many of my father's servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. Notice what he's saying, hand up. What's he say? I'm going to, what's he say? Die. The runaway son. Some of your stories, if you were to take the test, which character are you? You've gotten to that part of your story. I'm going to die in desperation. So the son decides something standing in this spot. Here's my prayer and my hunch. Some of you will make the same decision as this youngest runaway son tonight. he decides to leave where he has run away to and make the journey back to the Father. I don't know how long this journey took him to get away. It's a distant country. It's far away. And maybe that describes your life right now. But he makes the decision to turn his face back to the Father, back toward home, and he makes this transition back toward the Father. But as he does, he's like writing the script. Have you ever done this with your parents, by the way, where you're like, I got to talk to mom and dad about something. Okay, what am I going to say? And then you like start writing a script. Maybe I'm the only person who does this, but you like start writing the script in your head, and you're like, here's what I'm going to tell him. Like all the way back home, this whole journey that it's taken to get him, he's writing the script, and he's like, here's what I'm going to say. I will set out. I'll go back to the Father, and here's what I'm going to say. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I think he's genuine in this. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Notice those two words there. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to the Father. And then, while he was still a long way off, we come to this second character. Well, he's still a long way off, and I don't know how long he is. Jesus says in this story, the Father sees him, notices him. Now, as you're hearing this story, like you're putting the puzzle pieces together, right? Like the Father doesn't see the Son coming from a long ways off if he's not looking for the Son. I mean, if he's just kind of written off his Son, it's like, well, there goes that guy. See you later. Like you can connect the dots as you listen to this story. That's what's beautiful about this story, is that Jesus is actually telling you some stories behind the story about who the Father is. He's been looking and waiting for his Son to come home. And I was talking to a dad who has a son who's struggling. I asked him if I could share some of the details of the story, but a son who's struggling with some addictions to drugs and some addictions to alcohol. He's been in and out of some institutions trying to help him. And this dad was so broken, waiting for his son to come back home, that his body was shaking as he wept, as tears pooled and then poured down the corners of his eyes. He says, I want my son to know I don't see him with labels. I don't see him as addict. I don't see him as runaway. He's my son. This father was looking for him. And then when he sees him, I don't know what this scene was like, the father starts running toward his son. Which again, culturally, you're like, that's a little bit weird in their context. Maybe it's not weird for you, but if I see my dad running, something's going on, right? Like at some point, if I see my dad running, I'm like, there's a fire, there's a bomb, there's something happening, get out. But this father's running toward his son. Like there's kind of that side of me that's like, oh, dad's running, what's going to happen right now? Like he's going to take me out right now, right? Like at some level, like this is like a weird turn in the story. This father is like running, and then the text says he threw his arms around him. Literally, these words are this: the father's arms fell on him. Like he fell on the neck of him is the literal way that we could translate this. Like, I don't know if your dad or someone has ever given you a hug like this, but I remember like this kind of a hug. I have an uncle who's like 6'4", and I think he weighs like 350 pounds. Like anytime you'd like hug him, like this would be that kind of like all-embrace hug. And the father runs, and I don't know what went through the mind of the runaway son. Like, he's coming, what's going to happen? And the father throws his arms around him and embraces him. I've asked a number of students and a few friends who have difficult relationships with their own father how they read this story, how they see this moment of the father. Here's some of the things they said. I only wish that I could be embraced appropriately and lovingly in the way I see the father embrace the son in this story. Here's what she told me. I wish that my father would accept me and come out to me to embrace me no matter what I've done, no matter what I've achieved. I had a young man who said this: I long to be in a home where I don't have to pretend or prove anything. I can just come home and rest in the fact that I'm home and that I'm loved. I long for a place where I don't feel lost. Now, my parents may hear me preach this sermon, but when I was 16, I had my parents go through a divorce. When I was in college, I was 19, my parents got remarried, and I actually didn't know where they lived. Thanksgiving break came along, it was before Google Maps, and I actually didn't know how to get home. And this story and the embrace of the Father became meaningful for me. Now, I love this about the father. He comes up, the younger son, the runaway son, comes up with the script. He's like, Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Call me a servant. And the father has this moment, right? Like, the son has been hanging out with pigs. He could have said in that moment, shower. Some of you need to. He could have said, get your life in order and get all the money back that you owe me. But the father in the story doesn't hesitate to celebrate when lost things come home. The father doesn't hesitate to celebrate when his lost son returns. And so instead, what he said is this. He says, quick! Now, if you're the son, again, you're like, quick what? Like, what's coming next, right? Quick! Bring the best robe. Bring the sandals for his feet. And bring a ring. Now, this ring is really important because rings in the ancient world were a family ring, a signet ring. And they symbolize something. They symbolize that you were a child, that you were a son, that you were a daughter, that you belonged here, that this was your home. I don't know what happened to that ring. Did the son turn it in when he left with all of the belongings? Did the son lose it? I don't know the details, and I don't know that we need to get into it. But the father says, let me put this back on your finger. Then the father says, let's have a party. Bring out the fattened calf. Now, as I told this story to my daughter again in high school, she's like, how much meat is a fattened calf? And then we were actually camping at Memorial Day weekend in Arkansas, and there was a red Ford F-150 with a Razorback sticker in the back, and they were loading a Pit Boss smoker into the back of this truck. A group of tents were around there, and just being the awkward dad that I am, my kids were with me, so they were super embarrassed. I just said, looks like you all ate well this weekend. My daughter rolled her eyes. My son's like, Dad, you're so dumb. And I kid you not, this other dad, because we got it, he said, we smoked 300 pounds of meat this weekend. And I'm like, that's amazing. And then I went, oh, how much meat comes from a fattened calf? And some of you may correct this later, but here's what Google said, and Google's never wrong. 300 to 500 pounds of meat. And they don't have refrigeration. So let's just go with this dynamic. The father's like, let's have a barbecue and let's invite over some neighbors. And we're going to have some music. We find out later in the story. We're going to have some dancing. And we're going to celebrate the fact that my son who was lost has come home. One of the takeaways, one of the applications. We don't celebrate like God does when lost things come home. We don't celebrate the way God celebrates when lost things come home. You see, there's actually a third character, the resentful son. We have a runaway son, a running father, and a resentful son who hears the music. And he's curious, so he asks the servant, what's going on? And the servant says, your brother has come home. Your father's killed the fattened calf. They're having a barbecue. There's a dance going on inside. And he crosses his arms. And his face that was curious drops and is furious. And he refuses to go inside. So the father, doing what the father always does, comes out to the oldest son. He sees the son who is angry and has his arms crossed. And he pleads with him. The word is the word that's used of the Holy Spirit that comes and wants to encourage us to come home. But he has a script too. He answers his father, all these years I've been slaving, working for you. I've never disobeyed your orders. I've done everything right. You've not even sacrificed a goat and butchered a goat to give me a barbecue with my friends. And this runaway son, he comes home and you butcher the fattened calf and you dance and you celebrate. I mean, don't you know what I've done? And he refuses to go in. Could you imagine at Silver Dollar City, that moment when finally, and I remember exactly where it was. It was a fall fest, there was a pumpkin there. And I see the tears in his eyes, my little boy. And he sees me and hears my voice and runs to me and we embrace. Could you imagine if my oldest daughter, who was like 12 at the time, said, "Dad, why are you celebrating? I mean, I followed you faithfully." You see, some of you, when you see lost things come home and God celebrate, it'll actually make you angry. You'll see Jesus dining with sinners like the Pharisees saw, and you'll cross your arms and be like, I can't ever love like that. You see, the oldest son didn't get the heart of the Father either. The heart of the Father that goes out to both of his sons wants both of them to come inside. But neither one of them deserved his love. He loved them because they were his sons. He loved them because that is what he loves more than anything else. Jesus comes with the heart of the Father, and he tells this story because he wants you to come home. He tells this story because he says, I came to seek and save that which was lost. And I would give everything, my life, to see you come home. The Father says to the oldest son, my son, we had to celebrate because that which was lost is found. Now, I kind of wish Jesus would tell the end of the story. Like, I don't know. Does the runaway son at some point, run away again? Or does he ever now and again just look down at that ring his father gave him that represents his identity, that he is a child of the Father, that he belongs here? Does he look down and does he reflect on that love, that embrace, that moment when his father ran out to him and without him showering or paying anything back, just fully brought him into the family and brought him home? Does the oldest son, the resentful son, does he ever come inside? Or does he just stay out there thinking he's earned his way? Resentful, angry, so far away from the heart of the Father toward lost things. I wish I knew the end of the story. But I do know this. The same heart of the Father that we have in this story is the same heart that God has for you. And he has come out to meet you in this place, here on this campus, here this evening, running out to you, encouraging you. And I think the reason Jesus doesn't tell the end of the story, because he wants to ask you the question, which character are you? And then, like the Father, he wants to invite you home. So what's the end of the story? Come home. If you're a runaway, if you're resentful, come home to the Father.